She had been looking forward to this trip for months. The excitement of traveling to a new place, the fresh air of adventure, the promise of a much-needed break. A well-dressed woman of grace and poise, she had always enjoyed the thrill of the journey. The airport, though, was a place she had visited many times before, and each time it felt like a familiar routine, until today. The line at the security checkpoint seemed longer than usual. She stood patiently, glancing around the bustling terminal, feeling the usual mix of anticipation and mild anxiety that comes with air travel. But today something was different. There was an unsettling air about the way the officers were eyeing the passengers. As she approached the security officer, he gave her an odd look before asking her to step aside for additional screening. At first, she thought it was just standard procedure. Maybe they had to check her bag a little more thoroughly, or perhaps something triggered their attention. But as the seconds turned into minutes, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. "Please wait here," the officer said curtly, as he motioned for another officer to approach. This second officer was younger, more energetic, with an edge to his voice. "I need to verify some things," he said, holding her passport up to the light. She nodded, trying to remain calm, though a knot began to form in her stomach. It wasn't uncommon for passports to raise questions at times, but something felt off. "Are you traveling alone?" the officer asked. "Yes," she replied, maintaining a steady tone. He didn't answer, but his eyes scanned her passport intensely, as if looking for something. The minutes stretched on, and the lines of travelers began to move around her. But she was still there, stuck in this strange moment where time seemed to slow down. The officer's expression shifted from curiosity to suspicion, and that's when she began to feel the sting of discomfort creeping in. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone less friendly now. "I'm going on vacation," she replied, trying to keep things light. She had nothing to hide, but it didn't seem to matter. The officer motioned to another colleague who had just arrived at the scene. The second officer was older, more experienced. He spoke in a low voice, too quiet for her to hear clearly. Something was happening, something was unfolding that she hadn't anticipated. Then came the question that made her heart race. "Why don't you come with us for a moment?" The older officer's voice was sharp now. She followed him, unsure of what was going on. This wasn't the usual procedure for a simple check. Something had gone wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. They walked down a narrow hallway in the airport, out of sight of the busy travelers. She tried to remain calm, but the weight of the situation was sinking in. She was being detained, not for a random check, but for something more. The officers stopped in front of a small office and instructed her to sit. One of them took her passport and placed it under a bright fluorescent light. She couldn't help but wonder if something about the passport had triggered their suspicion. Maybe it was a small detail, an error on the document, but then the officer's words pierced through her thoughts. "This passport's fake," he declared, his voice carrying an air of certainty. She stared at him in disbelief. "What?" Her mind raced as the shock of his words began to sink in. "That's impossible. It's my passport, my legal document." The officer didn't budge. He was firm, unyielding, his tone suggesting that he wasn't going to listen to anything she had to say. She tried to explain again, but the more she spoke, the less he seemed to care. A third officer appeared, taking the situation more seriously now. The first officer's mistake, or was it an assumption, had clearly caused a ripple effect. The woman's confusion turned to frustration, but she held back the anger that was bubbling up. The officers continued to inspect the passport as if they had found something hidden, something she couldn't see. And then one of them made a shocking move. He held the passport in his hands and slowly began to tear it. At first it was a small rip, but then it became a deliberate, cruel act. The passport was being destroyed in front of her eyes. "Stop," she shouted, her voice a mix of panic and disbelief. "What are you doing?" "That's my passport." But the officer didn't stop. He burned the passport with a small flame from a lighter, watching as the paper began to curl and blacken. The woman's heart sank. She could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Her passport, the one she had relied on for so many years, was being reduced to ash right before her eyes. A mix of emotions flooded her. She was horrified, angry, confused, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her voice trembled as she demanded answers. "Why are you doing this? Why would you burn my passport?" She cried out, but the officers only exchanged glances. One of them muttered something under his breath as if trying to justify the destruction, But it made no sense. It wasn't right. This wasn't how the world was supposed to work. How could they treat her like this? The smell of burning paper filled the room and the woman's mind raced. Her passport was gone. There was no getting it back. And yet this wasn't the end of it. The officers still weren't listening to her. They hadn't given her an explanation, not a single reason why they had taken such extreme action. In the midst of this chaos, something inside her shifted. She couldn't just sit there and accept this. She was not only a traveler at that moment, she was a woman who had a voice, and she wasn't about to let them silence her without an explanation. In a calm yet firm tone, she said the words that would change everything. "I am the wife of the Attorney General," she said slowly, watching their reactions closely. For a moment, the room went silent. The officers stopped what they were doing, and their eyes darted toward each other. There was a shift in the air, and for the first time, the woman saw them hesitate. But that hesitation didn't last long. The officers glanced at each other, unsure of how to respond. Could she be telling the truth? Was she the person she claimed to be? The tension in the air was palpable as they continued to question her, and she could see that they were trying to figure out whether they should believe her or not. But what they didn't know was that the woman had never been one to back down when faced with injustice. She wasn't about to let them get away with it. She was ready to demand the truth. And what would happen next would shock them all. The room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier as the woman's words hung in the air. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her, their once confident and authoritative postures now uncertain. There had been a moment, just a brief second, where she saw their doubt, the brief pause that spoke volumes. They hadn't expected this. "I'm the wife of the Attorney General," she repeated, her voice firm but calm. It wasn't something she said lightly. The weight of her words was not just about her identity, but about the gravity of the situation. If they hadn't believed her before, they were certainly going to now. The officer who had been burning her passport seemed to hesitate for the first time since the ordeal began. He looked at her, his eyes betraying a flicker of recognition. He was no longer just looking at a woman with a ruined passport. Now he was looking at someone with power. Someone who was connected to a man who commanded respect. "Ma'am, are you sure about that?" The younger officer's voice wavered, though he tried to maintain control. He had been so certain moments ago, so sure that he was dealing with a common criminal, that his mind struggled to process the change. The realization that he might have made a colossal mistake was sinking in. The woman nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. She had to remain composed. She had to keep her cool. "I'm certain," she said, her voice steady now, though she could feel her pulse quickening. She didn't want to let her anger show. Not yet. Not until she had a clearer understanding of what was happening. The older officer, who had remained silent for most of the ordeal, was the first to act. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I need to make a call," he muttered, his tone sharp. The panic was evident now. His fingers shook slightly as he dialed the number. The woman could only guess who he was calling, but the urgency in his movements told her everything she needed to know. "Is it really necessary to make a call?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. She didn't know whether to be relieved or even more upset. She had tried to remain composed, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The officer didn't respond, his attention focused entirely on the phone. She could hear the quiet murmur of the conversation on the other end, though the words were muffled. The younger officer stood next to her, his posture now less confident. She could see the guilt in his eyes, the realization of what they had just done starting to settle in. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The woman glanced around the small, sterile room, trying to collect her thoughts. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? What had she done to deserve this? She had been a model citizen, always following the rules, doing everything by the book. She had never imagined that something like this could happen to her, certainly not in this way. Finally, the officer on the phone hung up. He turned to the others, his face pale, and nodded. The tension in the room was palpable. The woman could sense that the situation was about to change, but whether it would change for the better or worse, she didn't know. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his voice more subdued now. "We need to verify your identity. Please be patient for just a moment." She nodded silently, though her mind raced. What were they going to do now? How long would it take? Why had they not verified her identity in the first place? All of these questions raced through her head, but she remained silent. She needed answers, but she wasn't sure if they would come. The younger officer, still standing beside her, looked over at her with something close to remorse in his eyes. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I didn't mean to. We didn't mean to. Burn your passport. His words were awkward, clumsy, as if he wasn't entirely sure how to make amends for the damage that had already been done. The woman didn't know how to respond. She was still processing the shock of everything that had happened. She didn't want his apology. She wanted answers. She wanted to know why this had happened to her. I'm sure you didn't, she replied quietly, but that doesn't make it right. The officer nodded in agreement, his face flushing with embarrassment. She could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed the magnitude of his actions. He had made a mistake. A big one. And now it seemed they were all scrambling to cover it up. Outside the small office, the sounds of the busy airport continued. Announcements over the intercom, the hum of conversation, the shuffle of footsteps. But inside the room it was as if time had stopped. The tension between them was thick, and she could feel the weight of every second. The officers seemed to be trying to buy time, to figure out how to navigate the mess they had created. Moments later, another officer entered the room. He was older, wearing a serious expression, and his presence seemed to command authority. The woman glanced at him, wondering who he was. Was he higher up in the chain of command? Was he here to smooth things over or to make things worse? The new officer didn't immediately acknowledge her. Instead, he looked directly at the younger officer, then the older officer, as if sizing up the situation. What happened? He asked sharply, his tone one of command. The younger officer stumbled over his words, his explanation tumbling out in a rush. He explained how they had questioned the woman, how they had assumed her passport was fake, how they had destroyed it in front of her, and how only now they were beginning to realize the mistake they had made. The new officer's face remained impassive as he listened, but his eyes narrowed. You destroyed her passport? The older officer nodded. We believed it was counterfeit, but she's claiming to be the wife of the Attorney General. The new officer turned to the woman, his gaze piercing. Is that true? He asked, his voice stern. She met his gaze without flinching. Yes, it's true. I am married to the Attorney General. For a moment, the room was silent. The new officer's eyes studied her, and she could see the flicker of recognition in his gaze. He didn't know what to do with this new information. The situation had gone from bad to worse, and now they were all in deep trouble. He turned to the older officer. Get on the phone. Call the Attorney General's office now. The officer nodded quickly and reached for his phone again, dialing in haste. The woman sat quietly, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure whether to be relieved that they were finally taking her seriously or angry that it had taken this long. Either way, there was no going back now. The minutes dragged on as the officer made the call. Her mind raced with questions. What would happen next? Would they be apologetic? Or would they try to cover up their mistake? She didn't know, but she was ready for whatever came. Finally, the officer hung up the phone, his face more grim than ever. We've confirmed it. She's telling the truth. The woman's heart skipped a beat. Finally, someone had believed her. But the relief was short-lived. The damage had already been done. They had destroyed her passport. They had humiliated her in front of everyone, and nothing could change that. The new officer turned to her. We will make this right, he said, his voice sincere. We'll take full responsibility for what happened here. But the woman wasn't sure if any apology could make up for what she had just endured. The room was heavy, with the kind of silence that followed something irreversible. The woman sat in the same chair, her mind still trying to process everything that had happened. Her passport burned, her dignity tested, and now, this new twist in the story. She had been telling the truth, and they knew it. The officers were quiet now, their earlier tension replaced by the unspoken weight of their blunder. They had no choice but to acknowledge the mistake they'd made, and there was no easy way to fix it. The damage was done. The new officer, the one who had taken control of the situation, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. He stood by the door, his expression serious. He wasn't looking at the woman anymore, but at the other officers. We need to handle this carefully, he said. This isn't just any incident. We've already made a mess of it. The younger officer, still standing close to her, shifted uncomfortably. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The older officer, who had originally been in charge of her case, looked at the new officer, his face drawn and pale. We wait for instructions from above. There's nothing else we can do for now. The woman, still seated in the same uncomfortable chair, felt a wave of frustration wash over her. The apology, which had been a long time coming, still hadn't been spoken. They were sorry, sure, but words felt hollow. Nothing could undo what had happened, and nothing could give her back what she had lost in that small, cold office. She exhaled slowly, staring at the walls. The airport, with its constant hum of announcements and the shuffle of travelers, felt a world away now. Here in this room, everything felt contained, like a moment frozen in time. She was trapped, though not by physical barriers, but by the circumstances she had never asked for. "Ma'am," the new officer said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "We need to make sure your identity is fully verified. Please be patient. We are going to resolve this." Resolve. She had heard that word before. Resolve was what they promised when things went wrong, but it wasn't always enough. The question remained, could they really fix the damage they had caused? Could an apology ever undo the humiliation she had just suffered? "Your passport is gone," the officer continued, "and we need to figure out how to proceed from here." She nodded, her eyes locked on the officer. "I'm not worried about the passport," she said slowly. "I'm more concerned with why this happened. Why did you assume that my documents were fake?" The officer seemed taken aback by her calmness. Perhaps he expected her to be more emotional, more outraged. But the woman had learned long ago that losing her temper would get her nowhere. She needed answers, not apologies. "We didn't mean to?" the younger officer stammered, his face flushed with shame. He looked at the older officer for reassurance, but the older man seemed just as lost as he was. They were all in this mess together now, and it was clear that none of them knew how to get out. "What were you looking for?" she asked, her voice steady. "What made you think my passport was fake?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding hers. "There were inconsistencies in the system," he finally said, his voice low. "Small details that didn't match. We thought it was a forged document." She raised an eyebrow. "Inconsistencies in the system? What kind of inconsistencies?" The officer hesitated again, unsure how much to explain. "There was a mismatch in the coding of the passport number. Just a technical glitch, but we didn't know that at the time. We thought it was intentional." "A glitch?" she repeated. "You mean to tell me that you burned my passport over a technical glitch?" "Yes," he said, his voice quieter now. We should have done more to verify things before taking that drastic step." "Should have," she echoed, her tone sharp now. "You should have done a lot of things. But you didn't." The officer looked down, clearly struggling with the weight of the situation. He didn't have a good answer. There was no good excuse for what had happened. But at least he was being honest now. That was something. The silence stretched on again. The younger officer kept glancing at her, his face full of uncertainty, but she couldn't bring herself to comfort him. His mistake was part of a much bigger issue. This wasn't just about one officer's error. It was about something deeper. A system that was supposed to serve and protect her had instead failed her in a way that could never be fully repaired. Her thoughts turned back to her husband, the Attorney General. She thought about what he would say when he found out. She had no doubt that he would take swift action. But would that be enough? Would an apology from the airport be enough to erase the damage done to her reputation and dignity? She didn't know. The new officer cleared his throat, breaking into her thoughts. "We've made the call," he said. "The Attorney General's office has been informed. They're sending someone to meet with you as soon as possible." She nodded. "Good. I expect answers. And we'll be doing everything we can to make this right," he added. She didn't respond, her mind still processing everything. She had been treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of strangers, and now they were talking about making things right. But making things right wasn't as simple as sending someone from the Attorney General's office to apologize. It was about more than that. It was about accountability. "Will I be compensated for the damage done?" she asked, her voice cold. "My passport is gone. It was destroyed. It's not something you can just replace." The officer shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the question. That's something we'll have to discuss with the Attorney General's office," he said, his voice lacking confidence. "But I assure you we will take full responsibility." "Full responsibility," she repeated, her eyes narrowing. "That's what you keep saying. But that doesn't mean anything unless you show it." The officer opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by the sound of a knock on the door. He looked up, his face a little more hopeful. He stood and opened the door, letting in a tall figure dressed in a well-tailored suit. The newcomer walked into the room with purpose, exuding authority with every step. The woman didn't need to be told who this was. The man's calm, commanding presence spoke volumes. He wasn't just an officer. He was someone important, someone who had come to take control of the situation. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice smooth but firm, "I'm here on behalf of the Attorney General's office." She stood up, her posture straight. This was it. The moment of reckoning. She had been through a nightmare, but now someone with real authority was here to help her navigate the fallout. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let this go. Not without getting what she deserved. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady. "I expect to hear the truth today." The man nodded, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to change. The man who entered the room exuded authority. His suit was crisp, his demeanor confident, but there was something in his eyes that made it clear he understood the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just here to fix a mistake. He was here to manage a crisis. The woman could feel the difference in the air the moment he stepped inside. She stood up, her back straight, her gaze steady. She had been through a lot today, more than anyone should have to endure. But she wasn't going to let this man or anyone else think that she was weak or afraid. Her composure was all she had left. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "I expect the truth today." The man nodded slightly, his gaze scanning the room before settling on her. "I understand, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but with an undertone of seriousness. "I'm here to ensure that this matter is resolved properly. I'm from the Attorney General's office. My name is Director Harris." The woman nodded, though her mind was racing. She had expected someone from the Attorney General's office to show up eventually, but she wasn't sure what to expect. Was this man really going to make things right? Or was he just another cog in the system, here to smooth things over without actually taking responsibility? "Director Harris," she said, her voice slightly colder now. "I hope you understand that I'm not here for apologies. I want answers, and I want to know why my passport was destroyed and why I was treated the way I was." Director Harris didn't flinch. His eyes remained calm as he met her gaze. "I understand your frustration," he said slowly. "This shouldn't have happened, and it's something we're going to take very seriously." She crossed her arms, standing her ground. "You don't seem to understand," she said, her tone sharp. "I was humiliated. I was treated like a criminal, and you destroyed my passport without any reason." Harris remained calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He knew the situation had spiraled out of control. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm here to make sure it doesn't go unnoticed. This will be investigated, and those responsible will be held accountable. But first, I need to hear from you. I need to understand everything that happened from your perspective." She didn't trust him fully. Not yet. But she knew that if she wanted to get to the bottom of this, she had to cooperate. So she took a deep breath and began recounting the events that had led to this moment. "It all started when I was at the security checkpoint," she began. "I was just going through the usual process, waiting in line, getting ready to board my flight. Everything was normal, or so I thought. But when I reached the counter, the officer started asking questions. He looked at my passport, and then he told me to step aside for additional screening. I thought nothing of it at first. But then they started treating me like I was guilty of something. They said there was a problem with my passport, that it didn't match the system." Director Harris listened intently, his face betraying no emotion, but she could see he was processing her words carefully. She continued, describing how the officers had become more aggressive, how they had accused her of forging documents, and how they had taken her passport and destroyed it right in front of her. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain myself," she said, her voice tightening with frustration. "They just went straight to burning my passport. It was like they didn't care about the truth about who I was. It was only when I mentioned who I was married to that they started to pay attention. But by then, the damage was done." Director Harris exhaled slowly, his brow furrowing. "I understand why you're upset," he said quietly. "What you've described is inexcusable. The destruction of your passport was not only unjustified, it was reckless. We'll be investigating exactly what happened at the airport. But what concerns me right now is how we can make this right for you." The woman shook her head. disbelief creeping into her voice. You can't just make it right with an apology. My passport is gone. It's not something that can be replaced easily. And what about the humiliation? What about the fact that I was treated like a criminal when I did nothing wrong? Harris paused, his eyes softening for a moment. He seemed to understand the weight of her words.
You're right, he said quietly.
There's no easy fix for what happened. But I promise you this. We're going to make sure the people responsible are held accountable. This will not go unnoticed, and we will ensure you are properly compensated for the harm done. The woman wasn't sure if she believed him. She had heard promises like that before, but nothing had ever come of them. But she didn't have much of a choice right now. She had to trust that someone in power would take her side. That's all well and good, she said, her voice still firm. But what happens now? What's the next step? Harris nodded, acknowledging her concern. The next step is that we're going to launch a full investigation into the officers involved. We'll review the security footage, interview witnesses, and make sure we understand exactly what went wrong. In the meantime, I'll personally ensure that you're provided with a temporary travel document so that you can continue with your plans. As for the destruction of your passport, we'll be working with the relevant authorities to get you a replacement as soon as possible. The woman listened to him, but part of her still felt empty. A temporary travel document wouldn't erase the way she had been treated. A new passport wouldn't undo the damage that had been done to her reputation. The system had failed her, and she wasn't sure how long it would take for things to truly change. I'll do everything I can to support you through this process, Harris continued, but I need you to understand that this is going to take some time. There are a lot of moving parts, and we need to ensure that everything is done properly. She didn't know if she believed him, but she had no choice but to let him handle it. She nodded slowly. Fine, she said. But I expect results? I won't let this go. Harris gave a small nod. I wouldn't expect anything less. The conversation shifted to the logistics of the investigation, and Harris made it clear that they would not stop until they had answers. He assured her that the Attorney General's office would be involved every step of the way. But the woman wasn't ready to let go of her anger just yet. She wasn't going to be pacified by words alone. As Harris spoke, she couldn't help but think of the people who had treated her so unjustly. Those officers who had assumed the worst of her, who had burned her passport without hesitation. They had seen her as nothing more than a piece of paper, a document to be destroyed. But she was more than that. She was a human being, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget that. When the meeting was over, she left the room, her steps slower than when she had entered. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to rest until justice was served. She had been wronged, and now it was time for someone to make it right. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and constant updates. The woman found herself caught in a whirlwind of bureaucracy, an endless cycle of investigations and promises that, while reassuring, still felt distant. The pain of what had happened lingered, but she pushed it down, if only for a little while, because there was work to be done. She needed to know what had truly happened at the airport, and she was determined to ensure that justice would be served. Director Harris had kept his word, at least in terms of keeping her informed. Each day she received updates from him, sometimes in person, other times over the phone. The investigation into the airport officer's actions was ongoing. Security footage had been reviewed, witnesses were being interviewed, and reports were being filed. The longer it went on, the clearer it became that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger issue of systemic failure. The fact that their actions were being publicly addressed gave her some peace. The airport had initiated new training protocols for their staff, focused on document verification and handling sensitive situations. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. And though she still had doubts about how deep the changes would go, she had to trust that change, however slow, was happening. The woman's life slowly returned to its routines. She returned to her work, and though she had moments where the memories of that day resurfaced, she kept moving forward. Each step, though small, was an act of reclaiming the power that had been taken from her. Her relationship with her husband, the Attorney General, had only strengthened through the ordeal. They had always been close, but now he was more supportive than ever. He had been there for her every step of the way, offering his expertise and, more importantly, his emotional support. The bond they shared felt even more solid now, as though they had weathered a storm together. One evening, as they sat in their living room, he turned to her with a soft smile. "You did something incredible," he said quietly. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone who's ever been mistreated by the system." She shook her head, the weight of his words sinking in. "I didn't do it alone. There were so many people who helped, who supported me, who believed in what happened. I couldn't have gotten through it without them." He reached out and took her hand. "Still, you were the one who started it all. You were the one who didn't let this go. That takes strength. Not everyone would have fought back the way you did." She smiled faintly, but inside she felt the surge of pride and gratitude. She had fought not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged, for everyone who had been forced to remain silent. Her journey had been one of personal growth as much as it had been about seeking justice. The woman realized that this experience, though painful, had changed her in ways she hadn't fully grasped at the time. There was a sense of quiet satisfaction that settled over her in the weeks that followed. The media had picked up the story at the time, and it had sparked a much-needed conversation about accountability, transparency, and the treatment of citizens by those in power. There were debates about the procedures that should have been followed, about the ways in which authorities should treat individuals with dignity and respect. And though the conversation had quieted, the issues were still very much alive. The woman knew that her case wasn't unique. There were so many others who had suffered in similar ways. But now at least there was a chance for change. Despite the progress, there were still moments of anger. Every time she thought about how easily her life had been turned upside down, a flicker of resentment would rise within her. But she had learned to manage it, to channel it into something productive. She would continue to speak up to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure what she had gone through. The small moments of peace were the ones she cherished most. Time with her family, moments where she could laugh without a care, and times when she could sit quietly, reflect, and feel the weight of everything slowly begin to lift. It was a healing process, but it was happening, one day at a time. And yet, even as she found some semblance of normalcy, the woman knew deep down that she couldn't forget what had happened. Not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been mistreated by systems of power. She had walked through this fire, and while it had left scars, it had also ignited something within her. She had seen firsthand the flaws in the system, and now she was more determined than ever to continue advocating for change. She wasn't just a victim of the system. She had become a voice, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that no one was invincible. No matter how small the injustice, it mattered. It needed to be addressed, and those responsible needed to be held accountable. But above all, people needed to remember that each person they encountered was more than a document or a number. They were human beings. One afternoon, months after everything had calmed down, the woman was walking through a local park, enjoying the sun, when she saw a family sitting nearby. A small child was playing on the swings, laughing as the wind tugged at her hair. It was a simple scene, but for a moment the woman could imagine herself as part of it. A mother, a person who had not been defined by the incident at the airport, but by the things that truly mattered. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was stronger because of what she had gone through. Her journey was far from over. She would continue to fight for fairness and accountability, but she also knew she had to find balance in her own life. She had to live in the present, not just the past, and as she watched the child swing higher, she allowed herself to smile. There was hope. There was a future, and it was hers to shape. The fact that their actions were being publicly addressed gave her some peace. The airport had initiated new training protocols for their staff, focused on document verification and handling sensitive situations. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. And though she still had doubts about how deep the changes would go, she had to trust that change, however slow, was happening. The woman's life slowly returned to its routines. She returned to her work, and though she had moments where the memories of that day resurfaced, she kept moving forward. Each step, though small, was an act of reclaiming the power that had been taken from her. Her relationship with her husband, the Attorney General, had only strengthened through the ordeal. They had always been close, but now he was more supportive than ever. He had been there for her every step of the way, offering his expertise and, more importantly, his emotional support. The bond they shared felt even more solid now, as though they had weathered a storm together. One evening, as they sat in their living room, he turned to her with a soft smile. "You did something incredible," he said quietly. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone who's ever been mistreated by the system." She shook her head, the weight of his words sinking in. "I didn't do it alone. There were so many people who helped, who supported me, who believed in what happened. I couldn't have gotten through it without them." He reached out and took her hand. "Still, you were the one who started it all. You were the one who didn't let this go. That takes strength. Not everyone would have fought back the way you did." She smiled faintly, but inside, she felt the surge of pride and gratitude. She had fought not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged, for everyone who had been forced to remain silent. Her journey had been one of personal growth, as much as it had been about seeking justice. The woman realized that this experience, though painful, had changed her in ways she hadn't fully grasped at the time. There was a sense of quiet satisfaction that settled over her in the weeks that followed. The media had picked up the story at the time, and it had sparked a much-needed conversation about accountability, transparency, and the treatment of citizens by those in power. There were debates about the procedures that should have been followed, about the ways in which authorities should treat individuals with dignity and respect. And though the conversation had quieted, the issues were still very much alive. The woman knew that her case wasn't unique. There were so many others who had suffered in similar ways. But now at least there was a chance for change. Despite the progress, there were still moments of anger. Every time she thought about how easily her life had been turned upside down, a flicker of resentment would rise within her. But she had learned to manage it, to channel it into something productive. She would continue to speak up, to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure what she had gone through. The small moments of peace were the ones she cherished most. Time with her family, moments where she could laugh without a care, and times when she could sit quietly, reflect, and feel the weight of everything slowly begin to lift. It was a healing process, but it was happening one day at a time. And yet, even as she found some semblance of normalcy, the woman knew deep down that she couldn't forget what had happened. Not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been mistreated by systems of power. She had walked through this fire, and while it had left scars, it had also ignited something within her. She had seen firsthand the flaws in the system, and now she was more determined than ever to continue advocating for change. She wasn't just a victim of the system. She had become a voice, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that no one was invincible. No matter how small the injustice, it mattered. It needed to be addressed, and those responsible needed to be held accountable. But above all, people needed to remember that each person they encountered was more than a document or a number. They were human beings. One afternoon, months after everything had calmed down, the woman was walking through a local park, enjoying the sun, when she saw a family sitting nearby. A small child was playing on the swings, laughing as the wind tugged at her hair. It was a simple scene, but for a moment the woman could imagine herself as part of it. A mother, a person who had not been defined by the incident at the airport, but by the things that truly mattered. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was stronger because of what she had gone through. Her journey was far from over. She would continue to fight for fairness and accountability. But she also knew she had to find balance in her own life. She had to live in the present, not just the past. And as she watched the child swing higher, she allowed herself to smile. There was hope. There was a future, and it was hers to shape.